Hey.
Hey, everybody. Chris.
Hey.
We're live.
We're live. Hey, welcome everybody.
We're live. We're calling Chris Anderson in. Are you back
London.
in London?
Yes.
Hey,
And-
fantastic.
Great. And calling Rick Byer in Chicago.
I am in Chicago, where it is beautiful today, picturesque and crisp and clear. And we're happy. We want to welcome everyone to History Happy Hour, which is brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. And Chris and I may travel the globe, but we still come back to you.
That's right.
To talk history on Sundays and have a cocktail. Although today I'm on a water regimen, so.
And I just want to mention though that, since Brendan just joined us, Brendan, we see you and we'll bring you in just a moment.
Yes, precisely.
Yes.
We've had some guest issues, but the guests don't have any issues with us, and we don't have any issues with the guests.
We could by the end of it.
But we'll see where that's going. But we will be talking today about the Battle of Midway, and Chris, I'm deeply excited about this show. So just calm me down. You're just going to have to throw water on me all day during the show.
Uh-huh.
So hopefully that won't be too hard. Have we got anybody watching? Chris, actually, we have a lot.
We have quite a few. We have a busy group panel here today. Hopefully, we got lots of questions. The Templins, Xavier, our Spanish contingent, James Latin,
I see
Doug
that.
McCord.
I see people like Lynn Hargrove and Janet and Kurt from Wheaton, Illinois. And we have someone joining us from Drammen, Norway.
Hey.
Fantastic. And I don't think Bodvar Haugland, I think, is the best I can do pronouncing his name. Bodvar.
Sounds good.
Hope I did okay there. So we got a lot of folks watching, and before we start, I'll also say to Brendan, who's sitting in the green room there in the massive History Happy Hour studio space, that we haven't been able to reach Steven, so I'm not sure where he is or what's going on with Steven right now. But hopefully he'll be able to join us in a moment or two as well. So Chris, we're obviously on the tightrope today, but do we have can we have an intro here, and we'll get right to this show.
All right. The bar is open.
The bar is open. And Chris, we are 2 weeks away from the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Midway.
Yes.
Military historian John Keegan, a favorite of both of ours, called this battle the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. That's a statement that is not that is pretty out there, right? It's pretty strong,
especially for a British historian.
I know, it's not understated. And this truly is an amazing story, an epic carrier battle in the Pacific in June 1942 that changed the course of the war. And with us to talk about it today, we have the authors of a new book about Midway. Brendan Simms and Steven McGregor are the authors of the book The Silver Waterfall, How America Won the Pacific War at Midway. And Brendan is a professor at Cambridge and an HHH alum, and Steven McGregor served as an officer with the 101st Airborne, received a Purple Heart in Iraq, and he completed a graduate degree in history from Cambridge. Steven seems a bit held up, but Brendan is here with us. Brendan, welcome back to History Happy Hour.
Thank you very much for having me.
This is probably a good chance for us all to talk about your co-author because he's not here and he can't hear us. Wait, I did ring him up and leave a message and sent him an email, so I'm hopeful that he will come through. But if he doesn't, we'll just put you on the spot about all this.
I'm sure you can handle it, Brendan. This is that high pressure environment. So,
maybe
Chris,
he made the mistake of rebooting his computer like I did.
well, we never know, but we haven't even seen Brendan, Steven yet, Brendan. So, well, we have lots of folks interested in the Battle of Midway who are with us here. Listen, I have been interested in Midway since I was 10 years old. I used to have those Time Life history books, Chris, if you remember those.
Oh yeah.
And I remember very well the fold-out illustration that you would unfold, and of the pictures of the planes taking off from the aircraft carrier. But I'm betting that not everyone in the audience is quite as big a Midway geek as I am. So maybe, Brendan, we should start off with a little bit of overview. Midway, what happens there? Why is this a battle worth remembering 80 years later?
Well, it's really the turning point in the war in the Pacific, in the sense that the four carriers of the Japanese striking force, the Kido Butai, are sunk in the course of a single day in June 1942. And if you think of the situation in the Pacific and the Far East until that point, it had really been an unbroken run of Japanese victories. The attack, of course, on Pearl Harbor, then the capture of Hong Kong, the fall of Malaya, the fall of Singapore. And although the Philippines hadn't quite been completely captured at that point, the writing was on the wall there as well. So with the exception perhaps of the foregoing, the previous Battle of the Coral Sea, Midway was really the moment at which the Americans then turned around the story and essentially tore the heart out of the Japanese naval aviation striking force.
Oh, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, so Brendan, one of the things that you talk about in the book, and this is going to kind of be a little bit more background, but you talk about the Japanese suffering from victory disease and how that impacts on what happens. So, what is victory disease? And
Well, victory disease.
Really... I have to interrupt you, Brendan. This just in. Stephen.
Hey.
So you can either. This is like a game show now. Brendan, you can choose to answer the question, or you can pass it to your co-author.
Well, victory disease really spoke to this fact which I mentioned just a second ago, that Japan had been really triumphant up until certainly May and even up until June 1942. And of course, the Japanese, as a result, this was the argument of people like Commander Genda and others who were writing after the war. The Japanese, as a result, had become overconfident, dismissive of the Americans and their capability. And so they suffered from what they called victory disease, of which they were cured, it has to be said, at Midway.
Losing 4 aircraft carriers will cure you of victory disease, won't it? Stephen, welcome, and thank you for fighting through whatever you had to fight through to get here. We only said a minimal amount of negative things about you before you.
Oh, that's kind. That's kind. My wife and I just welcomed our 3rd child into the world. Gosh, I mean, what day is this? It was on the 8th of May, so not too long ago. I'm a lot of nappies in my world right now.
Okay, fair enough. Good excuse. Good excuse. So listen, we've been putting the brunt of this on Brendan so far, so we'll give it over to you. A lot of books have been written about Midway, a ton of them, and there's been movies about Midway. So it's not a forgotten topic or a little discussed topic. What made you want to write another book, and what did you guys feel sort of hadn't been said about Midway?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and there's a couple different ways of coming at it. I mean, you're right. There have been film. The film in 2019 was made. The earlier film in 1976, also very iconic, very memorable, and certainly had a big cultural impact, I think. And the story, I think you even see Midway reflected in something like Star Wars. Star Wars is if you think hard enough, Star Wars, you realize that Star Wars is just Midway set in space. There's so many aspects of the Star Wars story that are just you can tell that it's kind of been derived from the Battle of Midway. So it's a very important battle in I guess in American culture and Western culture, but even in sort of like military culture throughout the world. But I think in a lot of other ways the battle isn't known. I mean, like I myself, I of course I came from a slightly weird military background in the sense that I trained at the Air Force Academy. That's where I got my commission, and then I served in the Army. But Midway wasn't something we talked about. It's something that I think in military culture, it's known much more in the Navy. It's celebrated in the Navy. And the things we know about the battle in large part are overshadowed by other events in the Second World War. I think when we think about the Pacific Theater, we think about the Pearl Harbor attack, this dastardly attack. That's a phrase that's often used. Or we think of the atomic bombing of Japan. So Midway is so counter trend in all these different ways. It's conventional weapons. It's not these high tech weapons. It's conventional weapons. They're designed in the 30s. They're designed before the war. And really, that's, I'd say. So I guess what I'm saying is what we bring here, and the importance of our book is we provide the details of a battle which in large part are not known, and a very important battle it is, but also we show how these weapons were made. I mean, the inventor of the Dauntless, Ed Heinemann, he is really not a person who features in other stories at all, if he's even mentioned. I mean, so he's only mentioned recently in Kleist's memoir in 2016. Earlier accounts, like the films, they don't talk about all of the hard work and innovation that goes into the machines and the training, the pilots who are able to win this important battle 6 months after Pearl Harbor. So yeah, I guess that's a long way of saying yeah, it's a very important battle, but there are still important things to learn about it.
Perhaps I could add. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Oh, Brendan.
I was just going to add very briefly that we approach it also from, if you like, a wide angle and a narrow angle, in the sense that we deal with the story that Steve mentions, which is, if you like, a story out of American society, is what is the kind of innovation culture from which the Dauntless, the battle-winning dive bomber, emerges. So that's really a piece of Americana almost. Then we have a very narrow focus on the 5 minutes or so which make the difference, in which 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers are very quickly set on fire and ultimately sink. And then we broaden out the focus again and have a very wide angle look at the legacy of the battle. It's an important part of the book, and indeed what it means today. And certainly the first and the last part of what I've just described hasn't really been done before. The bare facts of the battle, of course, are extremely well known, and there are very good accounts of it. The only distinctive bit we provide there is that I think it is the most granular account of those 5 minutes so far.
So one of the things, this kind of plays off what you mentioned about the innovation aspect of it, Brendan. But you say that, or you don't say, but in the book you mentioned Adolf Hitler saying that the war was a war of engineers, and this kind of ties into your innovation aspect. What do you mean by that, and what were you trying to bring out in that part of the book?
Yes, this was something that really emerged from my work on Hitler. I wrote a biography of Hitler.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's really not known about him is his preoccupation with the United States, and in particular with German emigration to the United States, which he regarded as something which hollowed out Germany and enriched the United States. And Ed Heinemann is exactly one of those figures in the sense that he is the descendant of German and German-Swiss immigrants. He actually speaks German as a boy.
And he's the just to remind people, he's the designer of the Dauntless dive bomber.
Exactly right. And so he's one of those engineers that Hitler refers to, these German engineers now working for the Americans. So it's a slight irony that the battle, which was so decisive in the war against the Japanese, that the battle-winning weapon was actually designed by a German American. And indeed, in the 1983, when the US government got around finally to recognizing the contribution of German Americans to American aviation, his was a name that was very prominent in that commemoration. And Steve and I looked at the correspondence in the Heinemann papers in San Diego, in which all of this is discussed.
I fly out of Midway Airport in Chicago, and this is a Dauntless dive bomber. hanging from the airport in Midway. It was not at the Battle of Midway because they dug it out of Lake Michigan, and I don't believe I got far enough into the book to know that the Battle of Midway didn't take place in Lake Michigan. But you actually, the story of Ed Heinemann, the designer of this plane, you actually put that up front. It's like your first chapter, and he was very young when he designed the Dauntless. This is more footage of the Dauntless dive bombers taken in the Pacific. He was like 28 or 29, wasn't he? Is that about right? Anybody
that's right.
Can answer.
Yep, that's right. He designed it in 1934, and he was born in 1908, I believe. So he was young.
Yeah, and he didn't even graduate from high school. Is that right? Or
that's correct. That's correct. He dropped out of high school at 17. Did not go to university. He's sort of an innovator, very much like because Peter Thiel is encouraging guys to just go out and invent and pursue their dreams, and start businesses, and that in some ways that's what Heinemann did. He always knew he wanted to be a draftsman. He wanted to design planes, and he drew whatever he could, hoping to get a job designing planes, and he made his way into the field. He was there in California, so he was able to just kind of turn up and offer to do work for people, and ends up getting a job at Douglas, and he's there. He's kind of because this is during very turbulent economic time. So he's sort of working for one firm for a bit and then going elsewhere because there's a whole lot of different aviation companies there, a lot of different startup firms competing for different contracts, and it's kind of like the way the industry is dealing with the drawdown after the Great War, and. Yeah, so he's kind of in and out of Douglas, and by the middle of the 1930s, he's a project engineer there, and he is the one who takes the lead on designing this new plane. The Navy asks for a new dive bomber, and Heinemann is the project engineer for this project to design what becomes the Dauntless.
So in essence, this this peacetime effort in the 1930s. To design a new military weapon is what will win the battle in the 1940s. Exactly.
Yes, I mean every weapon system that is used in the battle, and particularly this one, it's developed before the war. The key pilots who deliver the ordnance get their wings before the war, and so the argument we're really making in the book, which is also a contemporary argument, is about the importance of peacetime preparation. Because we tend to have a view of the Second World War as one that is, if you like, is almost lost by the professionals in the early years. That would certainly be true to a certain extent of Britain, and is then won by by the gifted amateurs in the citizen armies. And while that is true in many respects in other areas of the war, it's certainly not true of Midway. I mean, Midway is really won by the peacetime U.S. Navy and naval aviation, and that's a really important lesson.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I really enjoyed as I read the book, there were several moments as I'm going along that you would just say something that would cause me to stop and say, "Wow, that's a new take," or "I hadn't heard of that before." But I just want to read a passage here and kind of get you to maybe elaborate on it a bit. You say that Japan's Navy did not incorporate air power into its tactics and strategy to the same degree that the U.S. Navy did. Yamamoto, in other words, was no Nimitz. So I'm sure that would certainly got me to thinking. I'm sure it will get other people to thinking. So stick your neck out a bit and explain kind of where you're going with that.
Well, I would say I'll jump in here, Brendan, if that's all right. I would say so Nimitz, Nimitz is an interesting guy.
We should mention. I'm always for the identifier that Chester Nimitz was the commander of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific.
Yes, yeah. He's born in 1885. He goes to Annapolis. He enters Annapolis in 1901. So and why that's important is because you think about his generation. He is well before air power becomes a deciding factor in naval battles. I mean, he's well before air power is even something that, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. This guy is coming from a completely different era. But when he goes to the Naval War College in 1922, he has an instructor, also named Simms, Admiral Simms, no relation that I know of, actually, and a classmate, Roscoe McFall, and they are very taken by the replacement of the battleship with the carrier. So the use of the aircraft carrier as a capital ship. And the way naval strategy worked was you would take your capital ship, place it in the center, and all of your supporting ships would be in formation around it to protect it and to sort of provide reconnaissance so they could find out what was going on, and then you could direct your fire from the capital ship. Well, McFall and Simms, they put forward the idea, we need to replace the battleship with the carrier, and Nimitz is persuaded. Nimitz is persuaded by this. He adopts the use of the carrier as a capital ship. And this is important because he goes to become the XO battle fleet off the west coast of the U.S. in 1923, and he implements the use of the carrier as a capital ship. And he does so even against the sort of protests of other officers who are saying, this is not how we do things. And so I think this speaks to the way in which Nimitz understands the importance of air power and does so in a way that changes tactics on the ground, well, in the water, at the sea, with the U.S. Navy. And Yamamoto never manages to because Yamamoto as well is someone who seems to grasp the importance of air power, but his support of it doesn't seem to percolate down into the Imperial Navy, Japanese Navy, to the same extent that Nimitz's does in the U.S.
So I want to bring in a question from one of our viewers who says he's fascinated. This is from Jim Lattin. He's fascinated by the intelligence aspects of this story. Are there any things you can tell us about this aspect that we might not have learned from the movies? Hopefully there are things in your book that we wouldn't have learned from the movies, or that we might have been misled by. And the intelligence here is kind of a code breaking and code, message interpretation story, isn't it?
Yeah. So the key thing here is, of course, that the Americans can, to a certain extent, read the Japanese code. So they are intercepting messages. Of course, that information is a great deal more fragmentary in reality than people would tend to assume. But there are people in Station Hypo who are putting together intelligence pictures for Admiral Nimitz. This, of course, is well known, and it's been a feature of all the Midway books hitherto. We discuss it a bit in our book, but it isn't really our story. So our story, as I say, focuses on this wide-angle approach to the battle, looking at three individuals, Heinemann, Nimitz, and then Dusty Kleist, I think we'll come to quite soon. So we don't actually particularly focus on the intelligence. So in all honesty to Mr. Lattin, we don't actually have anything to add on the intelligence picture. It's important, but it's not our primary story.
I do think you get an award for most honest author ever to appear on History Happy Hour. I think the audience bows down, and that is certainly going to raise your credibility, which is already high, on everything else. So.
I would jump in as well to say that it's an important question, and there has been important work done on this. One issue with it is the way that it influences our understanding of the battle as something which comes about as a result of something outside the actions of the participants themselves. There's a way in which this battle has always been portrayed as something that is in which victory is bestowed on the Americans by some outside force. Either it's luck, or it's divine intervention, or it's the failures of the Japanese, or even you could even say it's the code breakers. It's the code breakers. It's not actually the guys in the plane or the sailors on the ships. It's it's some other force, and in a way we are pushing against that. Well, we're certainly pushing against that narrative, and so I don't think we would ever want to take anything away from the code breakers, because I mean they're essential to allowing Nimitz to take this risk, to make a calculated risk in the way that he does. But overall, we should just, our story presents a different view of the battle, one in which it's very much something which is won by the American participants.
Well, tying this to the participants, just a quote from Dick Cromwell, and I could have picked others, but you say, well, Dick Cromwell said that the fate of the United States rests in the hands of 240 pilots. One of the things that really struck me in the book was so many of the participants, they seemed to have a sense of how important this battle was or was about to be. What do you think kind of separated this engagement, even before it happens, from kind of what had gone before?
Well, I think it's got something to do with the way in which Nimitz is setting this up. So he's already, he's traveling out, he's going out to Midway, overseeing the preparations beforehand. He's instructing his commanders, and they in turn are emphasizing just how important this battle is going to be. And then the individual pilot leaders are making the same point. So on Torpedo Squadron 8 on the Hornet, John Waldron is telling his pilots, how important this battle is going to be. And according to George Gay, he says, this battle is to be known as the Battle of Midway. So almost, as you're implying, even before the battle takes place, it's already been sort of mythologized, and it's been put in a certain space. It's being set up to be remembered.
Well, let's talk about one of the participants who you focus on, Dusty Kleist, because he's a pilot. He's a dive bomber pilot. He is not someone whose name was familiar to me, but I guess he had a book that came out a few years ago before he died. But tell us about him and why he's an important figure in your story.
Well, I would say so. He's born in 1916. He dies in 2016. So, in 2016 is the year of the publication of his autobiography with Timothy and Laura Orr. And he's born in Coffeyville, Kansas. He decides to attend Annapolis and graduates in 1938. Serves in the surface fleet for a time, and then pursues pilot training, which he sort of sets out to do early on. But it's something that in the Navy at the time, you had to go to the surface fleet first, and then after some time at the surface fleet, then you could go into pilot training. And Kleist is important because he is one of the pilots in the morning attack. The morning attack is the most important attack of during the battle. There's two attacks, and it's really what takes place in the morning that is decisive. On the morning of the 4th of June, Kleist is one of the pilots who successfully scores a hit on a Japanese carrier. So he's emblematic. He's emblematic of what the U.S. manages to accomplish on the morning of the battle. I guess that's where I'd start. I mean, Brendan, what else would you add to that?
Well, I would say this, but of course he is a German American, and that is not incidental to our story, which is also a migration story about the importance of this sort of ingathering of talent into the United States that we have as part of the migration story. Because in fact, Dusty Kleist is actually interviewed by naval intelligence in early 1942 on account of suspected German sympathies. It's in his autobiography. And so we make the point that, of course, what would have happened if he had been interned, like, of course, so many Japanese Americans were after Pearl Harbor, in that general sort of atmosphere of suspicion, which was perfectly understandable, of course. So that what we see in Kleist is that sort of embodiment of, on the one hand, the immigrant tradition, on the other hand, somebody who was all American and completely loyal. The other aspect to Kleist that we highlight in the story is his relationship with his fiancée, Jean. So he has a long correspondence with her, and in it he talks quite a lot about what it is to go to war, about his fears, about the fact that she's in a better world and he's in a horrible world, a world of pain and death. But that's a world that he has to enter into to protect her from it. And so we see embodied in Kleist also the reason why this war is being fought.
So one thing that I want to thank you both for in the book is a really wonderful description of what actually is involved in dive bombing an aircraft. Because, I read about it, but you made it understandable and accessible. So, for our viewers, and it ties in with one of the questions we have, could you give us a sense of what's involved in actually taking a Dauntless and flying against a Japanese carrier? And I'm going to attach to that a question from a William Baker, and he wants to, what happened to Hornet's dive bomber squadron in the morning attack? So we could use that as an example too.
Well, I guess to take the first question, what happens when you dive bomb? I mean, there's sort of one way of answering it is you go from 20,000 feet to sea level in less than 2 minutes. That's what happens. It's quick. It is it's a lot of pressure on the human body, mainly on recovery, though. It's a very interesting counterintuitive way of attacking the enemy, because what you're doing while you're dive bombing is you are hurtling toward your target, and you have to recover at the last possible moment, because that is what will guarantee or increase the likelihood that your ordnance will go where you want it to go. So in dive bombing, really, you are becoming the weapon as you go toward whatever it is you want to destroy. Which is not at all the way. It's not like contemporary weapons with smart weapons, guided munitions. These things find their way to the target. But in dive bombing, the pilot has to make his ordnance go where he wants it to go. So it begins at altitude. The pilot looks at his target, looks at what he wants to hit, and he has to observe the direction it's traveling and where he's coming from, and then think, okay, how am I going to move down on this target, and then where am I going to go at the end? Because he wants to make sure when he's looking at his map, he's going to be able to find his way back to his carrier. The whole time these carrier pilots are out at sea, they're always having to think about where they are in relation to where they want to be able to get back to after they've successfully attacked the enemy. So once he observes a target and the direction it's traveling, and he knows how he's going to make his approach, he then has to prepare his engine, prepare his machine to operate at sea level, because it's a completely different fuel-air mixture that he wants to use. So he makes all these preparations, tells his gunner to get ready because they're going to dive. He needs to be prepared for that to happen too. The gun has to be stowed because his gunner has his gun out to protect the plane. The pilot then, and this is all we tell all this from Kleist's perspective to kind of put you right there as he's getting ready. Yeah. Well, that's good. I'm very pleased to. Thank you, thank you, Chris. So what was fascinating. One of the things Kleist mentions is he smears ephedrine under his nose to open his sinuses, because it's an enormous change in pressure as he descends. From 18 to 20,000 feet from cruising altitude down to sea level. So once he makes all the preparations, he then enters a dive. And as he goes down toward the target, he has to make slight adjustments, hopefully slight adjustments, because he's done his earlier steps correctly, to make sure he's still going to release his ordnance in the correct place at the correct time. And as he descends, it's hilarious to read his account, because he says that the altimeter was only accurate within 1,000 feet. So he's watching an altimeter, which is not giving him the most precise information, because he's going to go down as low as he possibly can. So as he gets closer, then he begins to use a telescopic sight, which is in the front of his cockpit. It's a 3-time zoom, not very high. but using that site, he will guide his ordnance where he wants it to go. Hopefully release no lower than 2,000 feet, so that he can recover in time. And at that point, once he releases, he then recovers, and on recovery is when all the G forces come against his body. He'll go to as high as 9 times his body weight, and potentially even lose consciousness for a time, and then as he recovers, hopefully regain consciousness and return to his carrier after all that has been accomplished.
Yeah. Okay.
should I answer the question about what happened to the Hornet dive bombers?
Yeah.
Because that is, we don't go into that in any detail at all, but we do talk about it briefly. It's a rather unfortunate story. The Hornet Air Group sets off as one. They do that effectively. But not very long after launching, there's a disagreement between the commander of the Torpedo Squadron, Waldron, whom I mentioned earlier, and the leader of the entire group, who rejoiced in the name of Stanhope Ring, who was the so-called Sea Hag, so the commander of the Hornet Air Group, who was a rather dominating and unpopular figure. And the disagreement was about the question of where the Japanese carriers were. And Waldron was convinced they were in one place, and Ring was convinced they were somewhere quite different. And so Waldron actually just peels off. He says, "The hell with you." It's an exchange which is heard by everybody. It must have been demoralizing, extraordinary scene, really. And Waldron is right. He flies then more or less straight to Kido Butai. And his squadron is massacred. Ring is wrong, and that basically saves his life. So he plows on with the 2 Dauntless squadrons and the fighter squadron. But then in turn, quite a lot of them start peeling off. And then eventually, Ring and what's left of his command make it back to the carrier. And one of the interesting, it's a very minor addition, but nevertheless an interesting addition to the story we do provide in the book, is the recollection of a crewman on the Hornet, whom we interviewed, in fact, at the beginning of 2020. Sadly, he's since died. He's called Rich Nowatzki. And he actually overheard an exchange in which Ring talked about basically his reluctance to the fact he didn't really like dive bombing. He said it was like being beaten over the head with a baseball bat, which, if you recall, what Steve described earlier, is perhaps not an inaccurate description. So there was always a bit of an implication that he was a poor pilot and a bad navigator, and so that's the story of the Hornet Dauntlesses. They didn't figure in the morning attack.
Somebody who didn't like dive bombing and found a good way not to have to do it on that day, perhaps. We've talked a little bit about this, but I think it's important to mention, and it's important in the Battle of Midway, because there are other airplanes there that are bombers. There are torpedo bombers, and every one of these aircraft carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet and the Yorktown, have a dive bomb squadron, and they have a torpedo bomb squadron, and the torpedo bombers, I think the people who know the Battle of Midway know they all basically are massacred. I mean, I don't know what the number is, but if it's not 90%, it's about there in terms of those pilots being killed. Why does things go so badly for the torpedo squadrons, and does their sacrifice end up assisting the dive bombers by drawing down Japanese fighters, as tradition has it, as the traditional telling of the story has it, or is it a waste?
It's essentially a waste, and I think the established literature on the battle has really pointed this out now for some time. This idea that the dive bombers distracted the Japanese and pulled down the CAP, the Combat Air Patrol fighter cover, down to sea level. That would be true of the first 2 torpedo attacks, so the one by Torpedo 8 and then Torpedo 6. But of course, by the time the dive bombers arrive, those cap planes would have been up again at the patrol altitudes. Quite certainly, the time difference between Torpedo 8's attack and the arrival of the dive bombers is about an hour or longer. So it actually doesn't make the difference that is suggested in the film and in earlier accounts of the battle. There is an exception here, which would be the attack of Torpedo 3 from the Yorktown. That is actually simultaneous with the dive bomber attack, and in fact culminates after the dive bomber attack. And there is indeed a sense with them that they do distract the Japanese to a certain extent. But probably the outcome would have been much the same had there been no torpedo attack at all.
And what makes the torpedo planes so vulnerable? And if they were that vulnerable, why are they being sent against the Japanese?
Well, it's interesting, the torpedo planes. The best book to read on this is on this specific issue. I mean, we talk about this. We talk about this in the book. But Alvin Kernan, who was an ordnance man on one of the carriers at the battle, he becomes a professor at Yale in his afterlife, and he writes a book about the unknown Battle of Midway, where he really goes into the problems with the torpedo bombers. He and the Navy itself, the U.S. Navy itself, realized this, but they only realized it later in the war. The tactic at the time was to fly low and as slow as possible above the ocean and release the torpedo after maintaining a steady level flight, and so that the torpedo would enter the water horizontally. And what they discovered later in the war is that it's better for the torpedo to enter the water straight on as opposed to horizontally. And that horizontal entry, it confused the guidance system, and it damaged the torpedo, and it made it difficult for it to find the correct depth and to reach the target correctly. So it was much better for it to just be sort of plunged into the water, and somewhat similar to the way the dive bombers worked. Because they were flying low and slow off the surface of the water, it made it very easy to see the torpedo planes as they're approaching the Japanese fleet. If you're on deck, on a Japanese ship, and you're watching the horizon, it's very easy for you to see something that's appearing there just above the horizon, and it's very easy for you to train your guns onto that target. With dive bombing, by contrast, it's coming from straight down above you. So it's not something you're going to see until it's too late. And then even once you have recognized a dive bomber coming, it takes a while for you to train your guns up to altitude and to be able to hit it, even if it's there within range, because your guns can't necessarily go all the way to 90 degrees if it is directly overhead. So that's just a couple of reasons why torpedo bombing was less effective.
To that, I would add that, of course, torpedo bombers are highly vulnerable not only to the anti-aircraft fire that Steve mentioned, but to the combat air patrol. In fact, most of the torpedo bombers are shot down by Japanese fighters. With the dive bombers, by contrast, once they have pushed over, they're actually almost impossible for a fighter to catch, because the dive bombers have got special dive brakes to slow them down as they descend. So a Zero who will follow over in pursuit of a Dauntless will almost invariably simply shoot past it. In fact, there are stories of the sort of surprised faces of Japanese pilots just looking as they zoom past the Dauntlesses. So really the only way they can deal with the Dauntlesses is to catch them before they push over. But if they're flying high, they're hidden in clouds and adopting other stratagems, it's much more difficult. Whereas with torpedo bombers, it's like taking out an advertisement in the New York Times and announcing that you're attacking.
Okay. Well, switching perspectives, I guess, for a second. One of the, I guess it's the mythology of the battle is that you have the Imperial Japanese Navy. They're at the height of their power and effectiveness. They've rampaged across the Pacific. and they're defeated in this battle at Midway. And I don't know if this feeds into the miracle at Midway kind of idea that you talked about in the legacy section of the book, but you highlight a lot of doctrinal problems with the IJN at this point, and other issues with this Japanese fleet. Without getting into all of them, because I want people to read your book, could you just talk about some of maybe the organizational problems the Japanese Navy has at this point, or doctrinal problems, and how that impacts their reaction to these attacks?
Well, one aspect is the importance attached still to the battleship. Although Yamamoto was somebody, as Steve said earlier, who was a believer in air power, nevertheless, he still has a huge residual confidence in the battleship, and he's actually not with the force. He's a good bit further behind with the battleships, and a large part of the concept is that there will also be some kind of battleship encounter. So that's if you like, an element of old thinking. The other thing is that the Japanese don't put nearly enough emphasis on reconnaissance. So they don't put enough effort into, first of all, ensuring that the submarine cordon that they put in place actually is in place. So they think the Americans are still in peril when they're not. And they don't really have as good a reconnaissance system from their carriers. It's done mainly from seaplanes launched from cruisers. So these are two really important doctrinal difficulties which hamper the Japanese during the battle.
We have a question, as we get into the morning of June 4th and the critical time there, we have a question from one of our viewers asking about the problem that Admiral Nagumo, the Japanese admiral, had about the ordnance, the munitions on his planes. And this is, you deal with this in the book a little bit. This is sometimes referred to as Nagumos Dilemma. He has to figure out what he's going to do, and I think you can make a pretty convincing argument he makes the wrong decision, but he doesn't have a lot of good choices. Can you talk about this a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. So the dilemma that Budvar is I think alluding to is the fact that after the initial strike on Midway Island had failed to knock out the airfield there, he was under the compulsion, because he'd been advised by the strike leader Yuichi Tomonaga. He'd been advised to launch a second strike. So the planes that he'd originally held back, armed with fused bombs and torpedoes to deal with any American carriers if they appeared, those are actually rearmed with contact bombs for another strike on Midway. Then he hears that there's going to be, then he hears that in fact there is an American carrier force in the vicinity. So then the question is, what do you do then? Because Tomonaga is returning from Midway. He's got to land his planes. He doesn't have enough aeroplanes with the right weaponry to send out. And so essentially he does, as we know in retrospect, he does everything wrong. Probably what he should have done, and this has been discussed at length in the literature, he should have sent out the planes he had, however they were armed, to attack the known American carrier. Instead of which he waits until he gets Tomonaga back on board and rearms the planes a few times with the right ordnance. Now, what does this mean? Well, this means there's a huge buildup of discarded bombs and torpedoes down in the bowels of the Japanese carriers. And Steve and I found a really interesting document drawn up by the US Navy after the war when they were questioning their Japanese counterparts. And this particular document dealt with ammunition. And one of the Japanese witnesses says the thing about ammunition is it has a life of its own. It doesn't always do what you intend it to do. And we use this quotation to illustrate this fact because, of course, these Japanese carriers are then burned with their own bombs, because when the Dauntlesses come plunging through the sky and the bombs strike, it's not actually the bombs themselves necessarily that destroy the carrier. It's the fuel-air bomb mixture of the Japanese own fuel and their own bombs and torpedoes, which go up in a spectacular series of explosions that essentially burn out the carriers.
Yeah, and the other thing I think it's interesting about Nagumos Dilemma is that, I think trying to put myself in the perspective of the Imperial Japanese fleet, they go into this morning wanting a confrontation. Their intention is to attack Midway Atoll so that the U.S. fleet will respond by sending out its ships, and then there could be a decisive battle between the two fleets. And so I think from the Japanese perspective, when they think there might be American ships to their east, it's actually the news they're wanting to hear. I don't think that, as I was going through the material, it didn't strike me that they would have understood this to be somehow a bad news. They would have thought, well, this is what we're hoping for. Obviously, it's coming earlier. The American fleet's being discovered earlier than they expected. But to my mind, the Japanese were, their naval pilots were the most experienced in the world. They had incredibly effective equipment. Their torpedo planes were much better than the American torpedo planes. So they are good at what they do. To find out that the Americans are close by is not necessarily ground for them to act hastily. On the contrary, it's time for them to conduct a measured attack in strength as they prefer, and take care of the opposition.
But go ahead, Chris.
No, I was just going to ask you. So everybody says that Midway is the decisive battle of the war in the Pacific, and it totally changes the course of events, and that may well be. But you go into some discussion about what the war in the Pacific would have looked like had the Japanese won. So is Midway as big a victory as we make it out to be, or should we kind of hedge our bets on this? Or
I think the first thing to be said is that, of course, the war continues on for another 3 years or so. And in terms of the hollowing out of Japanese naval aviation pilot capacity, the attritional battle, the meat grinder and the Solomons, and then, of course, the big Marianas, Turkey Shoes, and other battles much later are more important. But in terms of the sheer number of carriers sunk on a single day, and the consequences of what would have happened had the battle gone the other way, Midway is crucial. Because if, let's say, all 3 American carriers had been destroyed instead, and Nimitz would have had to essentially retreat from the Pacific, that would have exposed California, not so much to invasion, or indeed Hawaii, but certainly to attack. It would have exposed Australia to greater attack, not necessarily to invasion. And what this would have meant is it would have essentially meant that the Germany First strategy agreed with the British. It was an important part of the overall approach to the war. That would probably not have been sustainable. The United States would have had to pour a much greater proportion of its resources, which were already non-trivial, into the war in the Pacific. And that would have changed the dynamic in the European theatre. And it would certainly have delayed the defeat of Hitler. So there are all kinds of ways in which this battle has ramifications beyond simply the Pacific.
Yeah, another way to make that point is in James Jones's memoir. He was at Pearl Harbor. He was in the American Army at Pearl Harbor during the attack in December of '41, and he says in his memoir that that this was that was a huge psychological blow to be there during the attack, to suffer that, to experience that attack. and then to experience the following 6 months where the Japanese Navy was seemingly moving at will throughout the Pacific. Yes, the U.S. Navy responded with some raids here and there, but it definitely seemed as though the Imperial Japanese Navy was the controlling force in that region until Midway. So Jones says that Midway is important for precisely this reason. It's psychological. It has a huge psychological impact on U.S. forces in the Pacific when they realize this is a war, and here in the Pacific, in this war, we can win. We can do this. We can fight this war.
It has obviously a great psychological impact on the Japanese as well, at least those who know about it. There's a scene in your book where a staff officer named Minoru Genda is in a lifeboat, and literally, I mean, there are burning carriers sinking all around him. And he puts his head in his hands, and all he can say is, "I wish this hadn't happened," which gives you an idea of what a shocking defeat this was. I mean, he couldn't even really process it, and it obviously was for the Japanese Navy. But then the Japanese public, we have a question about this, didn't find out about it for a while, did they? That was sort of kept a bit secret to keep their morale from going down.
That's right. They actually essentially locked up, or at least hid away, wounded survivors of the battle, refused to allow them to meet members of the public. Initially, the battle was actually announced as a victory, completely untruthful. Reports were issued, and the ships that were sunk during the battle are not actually removed from the register until some considerable time later. And it's for that reason, in fact, that the Battle of Midway, in the Japanese memory, is a matter of subsequent legacy. It wasn't something that they took on board in the same way in June 1942, because they weren't told about it. And of course, one constituency that was very important here was the Germans. They didn't tell the Germans, and Hitler subsequently complained bitterly about Japanese untruthfulness. He said they're constantly lying about everything. And it seems to be particularly the Midway experience he had in mind. So essentially, they just denied at first that they'd lost the battle.
And conversely, apropos to what you were talking about before, the effect for the U.S. was not only on the military forces, but also on the general public, because this was a widely celebrated, even if it wasn't at the time a completely understood victory.
Yes, at first there is this this rumor or claim that it's high altitude bombers which win the battle or which sort of make the decisive contribution to the battle, to the American victory, and so it leads to some bar fights in Pearl Harbor, if nothing else. So yeah, but there is Nimitz does recognize the importance of the dive bombers early on. So there are. It's true. The legacy of the battle is contested from the earliest moments afterward.
So Nimitz's response is very interesting, because on the one hand, as Steve says, he recognizes the importance of dive bombers. In fact, he sends a telegram shortly after the battle to Ed Heinemann, saying, "Thanks for designing the SBD, which is the Dauntless dive bomber. It saved us at Midway." On the other hand, Nimitz very cleverly uses the experience of Torpedo 8, where there's only a single survivor, famously, George Gay, and then he basically takes Gay out of the battle line and sends him on propaganda trips, which is very difficult, actually, ultimately, for Gay, but has a huge effect also on public opinion. So it's an example of how you can turn defeat, because definitely Torpedo 8 is a military defeat, but it's transfigured into a heroic myth, which has this incredible afterlife. Sells war bonds and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, do we have time for one more, Rick?
Yeah, Chris, it's you. Yeah. Go for it.
Well, we didn't.
I know. We've got almost an hour, but I'm enjoying the conversation. So let it go. Another question.
We didn't get to really touch on this as much as I would have liked, but you have a really wonderful section of your book on the legacy of Pearl Harbor and the use of Midway and its uses. What do we get wrong about Midway and how it's remembered? And is that, where does the miracle of Midway idea come from, and how should we remember the battle?
Well, there's a lot to say there. I would say very quickly. Yeah, I would say very quickly. It is a battle that is won, and it is won by men who prepare for this battle for years. For years they are in training, they are practicing, they are, in Heinemann's case, they are innovating, creating this new technology. In Nimitz's case, they're learning new strategies. In Kleist's case, they are learning how to dive bomb, how to perform their trade perfectly, so that when the battle finally does come, they are able to win it. So I suppose in that sense, it is a battle that is won through preparation.
Well, Brendan, did you want to add anything in there? Do you want to have the last word, or do you want to leave Steven with the last word?
I think Steve said it all.
Well, I think you guys have, I thank you so much for joining us today. And you've written a terrific book, which we want to remind people is called The Silver Waterfall. Will somebody explain in one sentence why it's called The Silver Waterfall?
Yes, this is from one of the fighter pilots, Johnny Thatch, who is covering the attack of the bombers and the torpedo bombers, actually specifically the torpedo bombers, and he sees the glinting of the sun on the wings as they dive down, and he says that they look to him like a beautiful silver waterfall. So it's a very striking image, and we hope that the cover reflects that.
Well, it's a terrific book, and we really didn't even talk about the whole section on the famous 5 minutes that changed the war, the granular part. But we left that out so that you'll go buy the book and read it, and then you'll get to enjoy it.
Yeah, I was gonna say I love books that really take a fresh look at events that we think we know a lot about, and you guys did it. It was really fascinating, and really enjoyed it.
And not too long, also.
Well, I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem with that.
But as people have to read a book every week, we do appreciate sometimes not having to read one that's too long. Thank you so much for joining us today, gentlemen. We really appreciate it. Come back sometime.
Thank you, gents.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Well, that was terrific and fun, and we made that happen, and so it all worked out. And Chris, what are we dragging out of the archives for next week? Because we're both on the road next week, and it's Memorial Day weekend, etc. So what are we doing that week?
I think we're revisiting the Russo-Finnish War.
Yeah, I think we are, because we scheduled that because it's kind of Finland is joining NATO or wants to. And they're probably beefing up their defenses, and people are suddenly starting to talk about Finland and Russia, and it seems like a good time to bring back this terrific conversation we had with David Murphy, and so that's what's going to be on the show next week, and so check that out, and then we'll be back in 2 weeks when we'll both be in Normandy, and we will be talking about Crusade in Europe, although sadly Dwight Eisenhower has not agreed to join us to talk about his book. But we'll have somebody else to join us with it. Brendan, hang on there in the green room for a moment. We'll come say goodbye. But everybody else, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your being here today.
Be safe.